Sthapakaya cha dharmasya sarvadharmasvarupine avatara varisthaya Ramakrishnaya te namaha. Why is there so much suffering in the world? Why is there so much evil around us? We see it everywhere. This is a question that many people ask throughout the world. This is an age-old question that you find posed by people in all countries, in all times. It's called the problem of evil. Why is there so much suffering and evil in the world? And there are two ways that this problem is posed, usually. The first way that this problem of evil is raised is from the standpoint of skeptics, people who question the existence of God. They say, God cannot exist. Why? If God existed, He would not have permitted so much evil and suffering. But the fact that there's so much evil and suffering throughout the world, so many Hitlers, so many horrible people, so many people suffering, and there's many people that seem to be perfectly innocent, especially innocent suffering. Why do so many innocent people suffer throughout the world? So there are a number of skeptics in different countries who have argued that the existence of so much suffering in the world suggests that there is no God, that God does not exist. And then that's one way of, I think the microphone is not working. Yeah, is it? Yeah, now it's better. And then there's a second way that the problem of evil is raised. The second way is, I don't doubt the existence of God. I'm a religious practitioner. I'm either a Hindu, I can be a Muslim, I can be a Christian, right? But as a sadhaka, there are many doubts that come into our minds in our daily spiritual practice. Suddenly we start worrying about what about this or what about that. And in that context, from the standpoint of religious belief, often the problem of evil also arises. And in that context, the problem takes the form of, look, I believe that God exists. At the same time, if God is all-loving, if He loves all of us, and if God is omnipotent, if He is all-powerful, why does God permit so much suffering? Why does He permit me to suffer? Maybe my child has just passed away. There's so many things that can happen. Why? Why? Couldn't He have prevented it? We sometimes wonder, even as people with faith, even as religious believers, these doubts come into our minds. So these are the two main forms that the problem of evil comes in. And I want to discuss today briefly Sri Ramakrishna's response, his solution to the problem of evil. And this is a problem that I've discussed in detail in the last 2 chapters of my book, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, Sri Ramakrishna and Cross-Cultural Philosophy of Religion. It was published a few years ago. So if you want a more detailed discussion and a more rigorous discussion, you'll find it in my book. What I'll give you today is just a brief summary of how Sri Ramakrishna explains the existence of suffering and reconciles the existence of suffering with the existence of God. Okay? It's a very philosophically original and sophisticated solution, actually. That's what I want to explain to you today. So, and by the way, all of the ideas I get about Sri Ramakrishna are taken from the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. The original Bangla is Sri Sri Ramakrishna Kathamrita, written by Mahendranath Gupta. So I'm getting it from his teachings from the Gospel. So, in my view, Sri Ramakrishna's solution to the problem of evil has 3 main dimensions. So I'll explain them one by one. The first dimension is called, I'll explain it in a second, but it's called skeptical theism. And I'll explain it now. But the context is, on the 14th of December, 1882, this is recorded in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, Mahendranath Gupta, the author of the Kathamrita, he's speaking to Sri Ramakrishna, and Mahendranath Gupta was a school teacher in Vidyasagar school. Vidyasagar was a great Bengali Pandit. And so Mahendranath Gupta had many conversations with Vidyasagar. So Mahendranath Gupta is telling Sri Ramakrishna about something that Vidyasagar told him. He's telling him. So I'll just read this dialogue. It's a very interesting dialogue. So Mahendranath Gupta says this to Sri Ramakrishna. Once Vidyasagar said in a mood of pique, "What is the use of calling on God? Just think of this incident. At one time, Genghis Khan plundered a country and imprisoned many people. The number of prisoners rose to about 100,000. The commander of his army said to him, "Your Majesty, who will feed them? It is risky to keep them with us. It will be equally dangerous to release them. What shall I do?" Genghis Khan said, "That's true. What can be done?" "Well, have them killed." The order was accordingly given to cut them to pieces. Now, God saw this slaughter, didn't he? But he didn't stop it in any way. Therefore, I don't need God, whether he exists or not. I don't derive any good from him. This is Mahanara Gupta telling Sri Ramakrishna about what Vidyasagar told him. He's very skeptical of God. He says, why would God permit so much horrible suffering to occur? Then this is Sri Ramakrishna's response. He says, is it possible to understand God's actions and her motives for acting? The original Bangla, Ishorer karjo ki boja jay, tini ki uddeshe ki koren. She creates, she preserves, and she destroys. Can we ever understand why she destroys? I say to the Divine Mother, O Mother, I do not need to understand. Please give me love for thy lotus feet. The aim of human life is to attain bhakti. As for other things, the mother knows best. I have come to the garden to eat mangoes. What is the use of my calculating the number of trees, branches, and leaves? I only eat the mangoes. I don't need to know the number of trees and leaves. This is Sri Ramakrishna's response. Now, the first thing is, when you study the gospel and you read Sri Ramakrishna's teachings, it's very easy to think that everything he's saying is very simple and easy to understand, but this is not true. And this is a case where I think, on a superficial understanding, you might think he's saying, oh, don't bother yourself with these questions. Don't ask these questions. Ignore the problem of evil. We might think he's saying that, but in fact, he's doing something much more profound. And this is what contemporary Western philosophers of religion, they call this skeptical theism. This is the basic idea. What I think Sri Ramakrishna is saying is, on the one hand, God is omnipotent and omniscient. Omniscience, sarvajñatva in Sanskrit, which means he knows absolutely everything there is to know. On the other hand, there's us. Are we omniscient? No, we're very far from omniscient. We're the opposite of omniscient. We know very little with our puny intellects. That's why Sri Ramakrishna, he would often use the analogy of a pot. And in that time, the unit of measurement was a seer. So he said, can a 1 seer pot hold 10 seers of milk? The 10 seers of milk is God. Can we, human beings with our puny intellects, understand the mind of God? This is what Sri Ramakrishna would say. So, in the context of the problem of evil, what he's saying is, look, Vidyasagar is giving a nice example of Genghis Khan killing 100,000 people without any good reason. It's a very cruel thing to do, cruelly murdering so many people. And Vidyasagar naturally asks, why did God do this? God could not have had a good reason to allow Genghis Khan to kill so many people. And therefore, I don't believe in this God. I don't care for this God. Sri Ramakrishna is saying, you should recognize that God, as omniscient and omnipotent, he may have reasons for acting that we cannot even begin to fathom with our tiny intellects. So one philosopher of religion, his name is William Alston, a Western philosopher. He's supporting a very similar position, skeptical theism, and he gives a nice analogy, which I think is very useful to appreciate the depth of Sri Ramakrishna's idea. He says, imagine that you are watching a chess match between a world chess grandmaster. Right now, the best chess player in the world is Magnus Carlsen. He's a young man from Norway. And on the other hand, he's playing just an ordinary player. And I'm watching this game. And they're playing the game, I'm watching, I'm enjoying the game. Suddenly, Magnus Carlsen, this chess grandmaster, he moves the rook to a particular square, and it puzzles me. I don't know chess very well. I'm just an amateur chess player. And I see, wait a minute, I don't understand why Magnus Carlsen moved the rook from this square to that square. Now, should I say, because I don't understand what he's doing, he must be wrong. He could not have had a good reason to have done it. Or should I say, is it more logical, is it more reasonable to say, I'm just an ordinary amateur chess player, this person is an expert, he's a grandmaster. So he may have a very good reason for moving this rook in this way, which I cannot even begin to understand. So in the same way, what William Alston is saying, what Sri Ramakrishna is saying is, God may have reasons for acting and for permitting horrible acts of evil and suffering, which we cannot understand. But we should never jump to the conclusion that therefore God did not have any good reason. God was not justified. How could God have done this? This is what he's saying is unreasonable. It's unreasonable because we do not have omniscient minds. We have just a very limited intellect. So we should never jump to that conclusion. So this is the first dimension of Sri Ramakrishna's solution to the problem of evil. But there are two other dimensions, which I'm going to explain. But the first dimension is what's called skeptical theism. The second dimension. Now, again, I'm giving you some philosophical terminology because I think it helps to understand what Sri Ramakrishna is doing. Again, this is taken from contemporary Western philosophy. They have a term which is called theodicy, Theodicy, theodicy. The term means, a theodicy is an explanation of why God permits the suffering we see in this world. Why does God allow all this suffering? There are many different possible theodicies. You can give different answers to that question. In Christianity, you'll find many different theodicies, different reasons for why God permits so much suffering, free will, because humans have free will, there are many other reasons. And in Hinduism, you'll find many different kinds of theodicy also. So Sri Ramakrishna, in the second dimension of his response to the problem of evil, he gives a theodicy, a unique kind of theodicy. He explains why God permits all this suffering in a general way. And I call this a saint-making theodicy. And I'll explain why just soon. So, in a conversation with Hari later became Swami Medhanandaji, one of the great monastic disciples of Sri Ramakrishna. So Hari was a very young man at the time, and Hari asks Sri Ramakrishna directly this question, the problem of evil. So Hari asks Sri Ramakrishna, why is there so much suffering in the world? And Sri Ramakrishna responds, this world is the leela, the play, the sportive play of God. It is like a game. In this game, there are joy and sorrow, virtue and vice, knowledge and ignorance, good and evil. The game cannot continue if sin and suffering are altogether eliminated from the creation. In the game of hide and seek, one must touch the granny in order to be free. But the granny is never pleased if she is touched at the very outset. It is God's wish that the play should continue for some time. So Sri Ramakrishna's main answer here, but this question comes up in many contexts in the gospel. In this place, his main answer is, this is God's play, God's leela. This whole world is God's leela. And in God's leela, you have to have both good and bad. Otherwise, the game will not continue. This is the first step in Sri Ramakrishna's response. It's not the whole response, but it's the first step. Okay? Then, but the problem is, of course, if I tell you, the reason why there's so much suffering is because God is playing. The natural question is, why is God playing in such a strange way, in such a cruel way? Imagine like sometimes young children, 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, they like, if they see an ant, they'll smash it. Or like a butterfly, they'll break it into pieces. But God should not be behaving like a 5-year-old boy, right? So this will be the natural question to ask next. And this is also asked to Sri Ramakrishna. So how does Sri Ramakrishna respond? So there's another dialogue where one of Sri Ramakrishna's neighbors in Dakshineshwar, he says, why does a man have sinful tendencies? Papa buddhi. Then Sri Ramakrishna says, in God's creation, there are all sorts of things. She has created bad men as well as good men. It is she who gives us good tendencies, and it is she again who gives us evil tendencies. Then the neighbor is not satisfied. He says, in that case, we are not responsible for our sinful actions, are we? He's a very clever person, so he's asking this. Then Sri Ramakrishna says, now this is the beginning of a deeper response to the problem of evil. Sri Ramakrishna says, God has ordained that if one commits sin, papa, one has to reap the fruits of that sin. Won't you burn your tongue if you chew a chili? In his youth, Mothur Babu was the very wealthy man who was looking after Sri Ramakrishna in the temple, Kali temple. In his youth, Mothur led a rather fast life. So he suffered from various diseases before his death. This Sri Ramakrishna gives an example. Then the neighbor says, why has God created wicked people? Then Sri Ramakrishna says, that is her will, her play, tar ichha, tar lila. Again he brings up lila. In her maya, there exists avidya as well as vidya, ignorance and knowledge. Darkness is needed too. It reveals all the more the glory of light. There is no doubt that anger, krodha, lust, kama, and greed, lobha, are evils. Why then has God created them? And this is a very important sentence. He says, in order to create saints. That's why I call Sri Ramakrishna's theodicy a saint-making theodicy. In order to create saints. The original Bangla is, Mohot lok toyer korben bole. Then Sri Ramakrishna continues, One becomes a saint by conquering the senses. Is there anything impossible for one who has subdued his passions? He can even realize God through her grace. Wicked people are needed too. God has created all kinds of things. She has created good trees and poisonous plants and weeds as well. Among the animals, there are good, bad, and all kinds of creatures, tigers, lions, snakes, and so on. Again, the neighbor is still asking. He says, then the neighbor says, then householders too will have the vision of God, won't they? Sri Ramakrishna, everybody will surely be liberated, but one should follow the instructions of the Guru. If one follows a devious path, one will suffer in trying to retrace one's steps. It takes a long time to achieve liberation. A man may fail to obtain it in this life. Perhaps he will realize God only after many births. So this is a long dialogue, but it's very, very important, and it has a lot of philosophical significance. So in this one passage, Sri Ramakrishna highlights 3 different elements in God's Leela. This world is God's Leela. This is the first step in Sri Ramakrishna's response. Then the neighbor is saying, but why did God create this Leela in this way? Then Sri Ramakrishna says, this Leela, this game, it has certain rules. We can think of them as rules or laws. The 3 main rules are, number 1, the law of karma. Sri Ramakrishna says, if you eat a chili, won't you feel a burning tongue? You must reap what you sow. You must experience the consequences of your actions, whether good or bad, in this life or in a future life. First law of karma. Now, the beauty of this law of karma is, as I said, this problem of evil is a huge problem, especially in Abrahamic religions. Christianity, Islam, Judaism, one of the main reasons is because they don't accept karma. And they don't accept punarjanma, they don't accept rebirth. So what happens is, they only believe in one life. This is the only life we have, and it's a make or break, do or die. And if we don't realize God in this life, then we're done. We have to go to hell. Usually it's hell, unfortunately. And otherwise, somehow if we manage, then we can go to heaven. Now the problem is, what about those poor souls at the age of 2, at the age of 4? They've done nothing wrong. You can't imagine what papa will a 2-year-old do. But they die of some terrible disease, cerebral meningitis, so many different things that young children in India, of course, there are many cases of this, in other countries also. So how will a Christian or how will a Muslim explain this? Why should a 2-year-old die after a long months of suffering, then finally die? The baby, how can a baby do anything wrong? It doesn't even have any moral sense at that point. They're stuck. It's very difficult to answer those kinds of questions. Whereas, on the Indian view, the Hindu view, which Sri Ramakrishna accepts, he says that baby must have done something in a previous life, if not in this life, you see. So this is a very important aspect. The law of karma is the first very important element in explaining why there's so much suffering in this world. The second element in God's Leela, cosmic Leela, is the doctrine of rebirth. I just mentioned it, but we should think about it a bit more deeply. See, is it realistic to think that in one life we can go from being a very ordinary person to becoming a saint? Is it realistic? Right? It takes many lifetimes. That's why in the Bhagavad Gita, there's an expression, a statement, Aneka janma samsittaha tato yati parangatim. After being purified through many, many births, one finally attains perfection in the final birth. And this is exactly what Sri Ramakrishna says. He says, a man may fail to obtain liberation in this life. Perhaps he will realize God only after many births. Right? It's like a long, this journey is not a journey of one life, but a journey of many, many lifetimes. So that's the second important aspect of Sri Ramakrishna's Theodicy, his response to the problem of evil. What is the third element? The third element in God's Leela is the doctrine of universal salvation. This is also a technical term used in Western philosophy of religion. Universal salvation means every single soul will eventually attain salvation, moksha, either in this life or in a future life. This is called universal salvation. Now, in Hinduism is a vast religion, as all of you know, and there are many different philosophical traditions within Hinduism. Not all traditions within Hinduism accept universal salvation. I don't know how many of you know this, but one of the philosophers of Vedanta who did not accept universal salvation is Madhva. Madhvacharya, the great Acharya, he taught Dvaita Vedanta, and in his philosophy, he distinguishes different categories of jiva. And he says only one special category of jiva will attain salvation. they'll realize God in this higher loka. Unfortunately, there's another category of jiva which he calls tamo yogya. These are the jivas who are destined to be in eternal damnation. They are destined to go to hell. After many lives, finally they'll end up in hell, and they cannot be saved, ultimately. So this is similar to the traditional Christian view, that there's an eternal hell. So it's a mistake to think that all Hindus believe in universal salvation. That's an exaggeration. There are some traditions within Hinduism which also do not accept universal salvation. One of them is Madhva's Dvaita Vedanta. But Sri Ramakrishna, it's 100% clear, Sri Ramakrishna fully accepts universal salvation. Now, why is that important in the context of the problem of evil? The reason is, if God is all-loving, why would he condemn some people to eternal damnation? How? What justification could he have for this? It's very difficult to justify God's actions if there is an eternal hell. So if ultimately everybody achieves salvation, then you don't have that problem anymore. So again, this is arguably a very strong advantage of Hindu traditions like Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy and many other Hindu traditions over Abrahamic religions, which believe in an eternal hell. So the idea is, if God is omnipotent, if he is all-powerful, he must be able to save those souls from going to hell. If they're very sinful, then God is all-powerful, you can save them, you can make them more virtuous, remove their sinful tendencies and bring them to heaven. Why not? And if he is all-loving, he should want to do that. Why should he condemn anybody to eternal hell? But by definition, God should be both omnipotent and all-loving and omniscient. If so, there should not be an eternal hell. Everybody should eventually attain salvation. But because Sri Ramakrishna accepts universal salvation, he doesn't run into that difficulty. So, again, Sri Ramakrishna says there is all this suffering in the world because this world is God's Leela, but this Leela is it's not a kind of random, it's not the random game of a 5-year-old boy. There are certain rules which even God obeys because God himself has created these rules. These rules are the law of karma, the doctrine of rebirth, and the doctrine of universal salvation. And again, universal salvation, remember, no matter how much suffering we undergo in this life, our children undergo, our best friends, poor people that we see throughout the world, no matter how much suffering we endure in this life, even in future lives, it's finite. The amount of suffering is finite, F-I-N-I-T-E. Whereas salvation, by definition, is an infinite good. There's nothing greater than salvation. Salvation means what? It means you realize God. It's unending bliss. It's infinite bliss. So if every single one of us is destined to achieve salvation, it means that salvation that we will eventually attain infinitely outweighs any suffering that we endure in this life and in our past lives and in our future lives. Because all that suffering is still a finite amount. And salvation is an infinite good. So this is the basic logic, okay? This is the second dimension of Sri Ramakrishna's solution to the problem of evil. First dimension is skeptical theism. We shouldn't expect to understand why God does what he does, why he permits suffering. Second dimension is what I call a saint-making theodicy. God has created this world as a spiritual and moral gymnasium. Just as students will go to a gymnasium to exercise. This world, Swami Medhanandaji says the same thing. He says God has created this world as a moral gymnasium in which we have come to grow strong. Not physically strong, but morally strong, spiritually strong, so that we can come closer to God and eventually realize God. This is the basic idea of the second dimension. God has created this world as a moral and spiritual gymnasium where in the course of many, many lives, we slowly acquire moral and spiritual qualities through encountering both good and evil. Now you might ask, why do we have to encounter evil in order to grow morally and spiritually? The idea is, when we see good people doing good things, just imagine Gandhiji and Swami Vivekananda and Sri Ramakrishna and so many other great saints, Christ. What do we learn from them? They become our role models, and we say we should try to be like them. Let's try to emulate them in our own lives. Let's try to acquire some of the qualities that these saints have to a perfect degree. So we learn from good, but then how do we learn from evil? Again, when we see somebody doing something evil, we learn in many different ways. Number one, we see how do they end up ultimately? These people who commit evil deeds, at the end of their life, are they happy? Most of the time, you'll find they become miserable. Secondly, even if we don't see that they're experiencing unhappiness, another thing is when we see evil people, you can think of them as a kind of mirror which you hold up against yourself. And it's a way of reflecting your own evil tendencies. And you start realizing, wait a minute, those same evil deeds that those people are doing, I have the same qualities in myself. And if I don't go on the right path, the moral path, the spiritual path, I myself may be doing the same things. And I will end up in the same predicament and be unhappy. So we cannot grow morally and spiritually just if this world were just a playground with only positive things. We wouldn't be able to grow morally. We wouldn't be tested. We wouldn't be challenged. This is the basic idea of the second dimension of Sri Ramakrishna's response to the problem of evil. And finally, the third dimension. Now, as I said, some of these visitors of Sri Ramakrishna, they're very clever. And they would push, and many times they were not satisfied with Sri Ramakrishna's answers. And Hari, Swami Medhanandaji, he was one of these. He had a very sharp intellect. So even after Sri Ramakrishna explains all of this, Hari says, but this play of God is our death. It's a very beautiful, it's a very poetic statement. Khelai je amader pranjai in Bangla, God's lila is our death. Even if God has made this world as a spiritual gymnasium, God is omnipotent. Why did he make this world in such a way? Why did he create this gymnasium in such a way that we have to suffer so much? He's not suffering, we're suffering. What does Sri Ramakrishna say? So this is the third dimension, the third and final dimension of Sri Ramakrishna's response to the problem of evil, is he goes into the mystical standpoint of Vijnana. I'll just read this. This is what Sri Ramakrishna says in response to Hari. Smiling. Sri Ramakrishna has a smile. He says, please tell me who you are. God alone has become all this. Maya, Jivas, the universe, and the 24 cosmic principles. As the snake I bite, and as the charmer I cure, it is God herself who has become both vidya, knowledge, and avidya, ignorance. Okay? She remains deluded by avidya maya, the knowledge, the maya of ignorance. Again, with the help of the guru, she is cured. She meaning God. She is cured by vidya maya, the maya of knowledge. Ignorance, knowledge, and intimate knowledge. Ajnana, jnana, vijnana. The jnani sees that God alone exists and is the doer, that she creates, preserves, and destroys. The Vijnani sees that it is God who has become all this. This is a very profound response, which Sri Ramakrishna finally, when he's finally pushed, he says, the problem of evil presupposes that I am different from God. If I'm the same as God, then the problem won't arise. The problem of evil is, why does God allow us to suffer? Sri Ramakrishna says, who are you? You are nothing but God. God is playing in the form of his suffering creatures and as the evildoers themselves and as the ruler of the universe. There's nothing but God. In the Leela Prasanga, the Sharadanandaji's biography of Sri Ramakrishna, there's a beautiful incident during Sri Ramakrishna's sadhana period when Sri Ramakrishna suddenly sees a butterfly. And I'll just read this. This is directly from Leela Prasanga, the divine play. One day, the master, Sri Ramakrishna, saw a butterfly flying towards him with a tiny stick in its tail. At first, he was pained by the thought that some naughty boy had done this. But in the next moment, he said in ecstasy, "O Rama, you have created your own distress," and then burst into laughter. This is a very telling incident. The idea is, Sri Ramakrishna, when he saw the poor butterfly with this stick in its wing, he felt that pain very viscerally. He felt, I'm sure some naughty 5-year-old, I mentioned that naughty boy earlier, must be some naughty boy who cruelly stuck that stick into the butterfly. How dare he? Why does God permit this kind of evil to occur? In the next moment, he flew into this mystical state of Vijnana, this ecstatic state of Vijnana, when suddenly he saw, no, that boy himself, the naughty boy is God, the butterfly is God, I also am God. This whole thing is nothing but God's play. And at that moment, the problem of evil, he didn't solve the problem of evil. When you attain this mystical state of Vijnana, you don't solve the problem of evil, you dissolve the problem of evil. The problem is dissolved because it doesn't even arise. Because there's no difference between God and his suffering creatures. So these are the three main dimensions of Sri Ramakrishna's solution to the problem of evil. You might think, oh, this is very dry philosophy. Why bother about all these things? Remember what I said at the beginning of this lecture. This is not dry philosophy. This is a doubt that comes up in many of our lives as sadhakas. How many of you have wondered, when somebody close to you dies, you might ask, why did Sri Ramakrishna allow my loved one, my daughter, my husband, my best friend, why? Why did he have to die such a cruel death, suffering from cancer for 3 years, then suddenly passing away? Why? These questions arise in all of our minds. So by thinking about how Sri Ramakrishna responds to this is a way of strengthening and deepening our faith in God. This is the main purpose of all of this kind of vichara. This is not dry vichara. This is a very important kind of vichara, which is an aspect of our spiritual practice. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.